أعوذ بالله من شر الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم محمد وأهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. اللهم صل Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Last night we began with the story of Nabi Lut alayhi salam. And we began that story and we made our way through the story almost until the very end. I wanted to begin tonight with the question of why is it important for me and you to even discuss this issue? Because, to be honest with you, it can be a little bit of an uncomfortable discussion. And I think one of the natural reactions that we have as a religious community when we see these kinds of things in our society is our initial reaction is that we want to hide away from it. We want to pretend like it doesn't exist, that it's not going to have any effect within our own communities, within our own families. But one of the things that we've seen is that whatever is happening in the greater community of the country that you live in, gradually, those ideas, those concepts, they begin to seep into every aspect of the society that we live in, even those that are within the religious communities. We've gathered on these nights to commemorate the sacrifice of Imam Hussein. And in reality, if you think to yourself, one of the reasons why we commemorate is because we are trying to prepare ourselves for the coming of Imam Sahib al-Asri wa Zaman alayhi salam. This is the essence. This is why we gather. This is why we mourn. This is why we cry. We are looking at the mistakes that the people of the past had made. The mistakes which prevented them from connecting with their Imam. And we are trying to prevent those same mistakes from happening to us. This issue is one of the issues that if we are not wary, if we are not careful, it can become one of the means of disconnection from the Imam of our time. Now, last night we began with the story of Nabi Lut alayhi salam, and we went into how the people of Sodom, they had been a good group of people initially. And one of the things that the people of Sodom were known for was their great generosity to those in need. If you were poor, if you were poverty-stricken, if you were a traveler in need of food, in need of a place to stay, then you knew that if you went into the cities of Sodom, they would have food for you, they would have lodging for you, they would take care of you. At one point, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He decides, I'm going to test the people of Sodom with a little bit of reducing their rizq. I want to see if this generosity that they have, will they at least maintain? Or as soon as I reduce their rizq, they're going to change for the worst. And unfortunately, through the tricks of shaitan, they begin to turn away the travelers, they begin to turn away the poor. The poor and the travelers begin to take from their produce that was growing in their farms and on their trees. And eventually shaitan comes with the idea that the way in which you can push these people away and make sure no one will ever steal from you is that whenever they come, you will attack them, you will assault them. And so through this methodology, eventually the sin spreads within the society and it becomes part and parcel of who they are. And it changes even the behavior that they had, the ways of dress that they had, even to the point that their eating habits change. They become very gluttonous, that from morning to night they are eating. They can't stop eating. When it comes to their clothing, they begin to dress in immodest ways, and so every aspect of their behavior changes. Nabi Lut alayhi salam, after many, many years, he is preaching to them, he is trying to get them to change. he eventually comes to the realization that it's not working. Now, one of the practices that Nabi Lut alayhi salam had, and we see this with many of the Anbiya, but it was particularly important with Nabi Lut, is that whenever travelers would come from outside of the city, during that time period, it wasn't as if they had Google Maps. Of course, many people who were travelers, they knew not to come into the city of Sodom. Today, if you were traveling and there was the city of Sodom on your path, it would probably have a warning on Google Maps, do not enter, danger. At that time period, they didn't have the blessings of Google Maps. And so sometimes some travelers, they wouldn't hear about the situation in the city, the dangers of the city, and so they would accidentally cross paths and they would enter into the town. One of the practices of Nabi Lut is that whenever he would see these travelers, in order to protect them, he would say that I am welcoming you as my guests, I'm going to host you. And so during that period of time, what it meant is that they were under the protection of Nabi Lut. Even today, if you look at tribal areas in the world, you look at the Pashtuns of Afghanistan, you look at other tribal areas, one of the codes that they have is that if a guest comes and they are staying at the home of one of the tribal members, then they are under the protection of that individual. And it's very dishonorable if anyone attacks them, steals from them, hurts them in any way. It's actually a type of dishonor, not only for that individual, but for the entirety of the tribe. And so, as a way of protecting these travelers, Nabi Lut, he would quickly invite them to his home, and they would be protected from the attacks of the people of Sodom. Now, as you can imagine, the people of Sodom, they didn't like this. And so they would get upset at Nabi Lut. They would argue with him. They would say, oh Lut, you shouldn't do this. This is the last time we're going to accept it from you. But every single time Nabi Lut would do this. And this was becoming a point of contention between the people of Lut and himself alayhi salam. Eventually, Nabi Lut, he looks around, he realizes that it's been over 30 years of preaching amongst these people. I've spoken to them privately, I've spoken to them publicly, I've used emotion, I've used logic, I've used every methodology to convince them that this sin that they are engaged in is one of the greatest of sins. But it seems that instead of getting better, they are getting worse. And so Nabi Lut alayhi salam, he raises his hands in dua. He says, Ya Allah, I have done everything I can. I've done everything that I can. I don't know what else to do. It seems like they're even getting worse. He says, Ya Allah, you do something about this situation. I really don't have anything else that I can think of. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he decides that the time for the punishment of the people of Sodom has arrived. What does Allah do? He sends down 4 of his malaika, his angels. But whenever Allah sends down malaika, one of the things that we notice is that he sends them down in the form of human beings. If you were to see them, maybe you wouldn't realize that these are angels. You would see them as other human beings. And so he sends them down in the form of travelers who have come into the city of Sodom. They enter upon the city in a place where Nabi Lut alayhi salam, on the outskirts of that city, he was there. They come to him, they say that we are travelers, we want to be your guest, O Lut. Would you please be so kind as to host us? Nabi Lut, he looks at them, he says, this is probably not the best idea. I think you should continue to go. This city is not very hospitable to guests. They insist. They say that really, we insist. Can we please be your guests? Again, he tells them, please, you really don't want to stay here. This is not a good group of people. Again, the malaika, they insist. Nabi Lut alayhi salam, eventually he sees there's no choice. He says, let me bring you in, but I'm going to bring you in through a back way so no one realizes that you are here. He quickly brings them into the town through the paths which were not that busy, so that no one sees. He brings them into his house. He closes the gate to his house. He enters into the house and he sees that his wife Qiwab is looking at the guests. Now, Nabi Lut's wife Qiwab, she had originally been from those who believed in his message, but as time had gone on, she had begun to revert back to her people. And so one of the things that Qiwab was known for, unfortunately, is that whenever Nabi Lut would bring these guests into his house, she would use certain signals to tell the people of Sodom that guests have come into the town. Guests are now in the house of Nabi Lut alayhi salam. When Lut alayhi salam, he sees the wife has noticed, she's there, he says, please, I beg of you, I know that you've betrayed me many times before, but this one time, please, don't tell the people that we have guests. If you do this, I'm going to forgive all of your past mistakes, all of the things that you've done against me, I'll forget all of it. But please, this one time, do not dishonor me in front of these guests. Now, in the midst of all of this, Nabi Lut alayhi salam, he doesn't realize that these are angels, these are malaika. Qiwab, she promises, and immediately she goes and she announces to the people that Nabi Lut alayhi salam, he has guests. People, they begin to gather around the gate. They're arguing with Lut alayhi salam, we want to come in, give us over the guests. Nabi Lut is arguing back. He's saying that this is dishonorable. Do not embarrass me in front of these guests. And they're arguing back. Nabi Lut, he doesn't know what to do at this point. At one point, Jibreel alayhi salam, he comes forward, he introduces himself. He says, O Lut, we are actually the malaika of your Lord. We are actually from the angels of your Lord. Do not have any fear. They tell Lut, go and open the gates. Lut alayhi salam, he goes forward, he opens the gates, the people rush in. Jibreel, he stands in front of this horde, this mob of people. And he raises his hands and he simply makes a motion with his fingers. As soon as he makes the motion, all of those people, they suddenly become blind. They're not able to see. And in their fear, in their confusion, they rush outside of the gate, outside of the home. But before they leave, and this is something which amazes me, before they leave, they yell out that we will be back by morning time. Now, I don't know about you, but if I was in a situation where an individual raises their hands, they go like this, I can't see anymore. The last thing on my mind is going to be, I'll get you in the morning. But these people were so influenced by sin, they were so intoxicated by sin, that even though they're now blind, they can't even see what's going on, their only thought is that we're going to come back in the morning time, we're going to get these people. The malaika, they tell Nabi Lut alayhi salam that the time of the punishment has come, you need to evacuate the city. Nabi Lut alayhi salam, he makes preparations, he gathers his things, he and his two daughters, they begin to make their way outside of the city. As they are nearing the outer limits of the city, they begin to feel a tremor in the ground. And they realize that the punishment of Allah has begun. And as they continue, the punishment engulfs the people of Sodom. We have a hadith, brothers and sisters. It is one of the most severe punishments. That when you look at all of the different qawms who were punished by Allah, this is one of the most severe punishments that I have seen. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He does several things, but the main way that the people of Sodom were destroyed is that the entirety of the city was uprooted. It was lifted up into the heavens. And then it was thrown into the ocean. It was thrown into the sea. Now, Nabi Lut alayhi salam, his two daughters, they make their way back to the city of Al-Khalil, the city where Ibrahim alayhi salam is still propagating Islam. And here, just by way, I want to mention something, that the two daughters of Nabi Lut alayhi salam, they marry, and from their lineage comes many other anbiya. And the reason I mention this is that when you compare the religions of Islam and Christianity, there's a very big difference in how the daughters of Nabi Lut are seen. In Islam, they are seen as chaste and honorable women. In the religion of Christianity, when you look at the Bible, there is a different version. There is something else that is mentioned about them. So there is this major difference between the religion of Islam when it treats the Anbiya, the prophets of God, and the Bible. Now here, this is the end of the story of Nabi Lut. I wanted to open up the second section for tonight. The second section for tonight is that I wanted to go through a number of very important issues in regards to this story. Meaning that when we were reading this story, a number of questions may have come to your minds. And when we are living in this society, a number of criticisms are going to be asked of you in regards to this issue of homosexuality. So tonight, I wanted to, inshallah, go through these one at a time. We want to tackle these, and we want to answer these. Question number one, issue number one. Today, when you look at this group of people, this community, one of the ways in which they will introduce themselves is that when someone introduces themselves, they say that we are, for example, homosexuals. Now, what's interesting is that when you look at them, you can ask the question that, why do you identify yourself first and foremost as this? Because as human beings, we are many things. Someone can say that I am a software engineer. I spend 10 or 12 hours of my day programming. And then when I come home, I go to the gym. I'm a bodybuilder. I lift weights. And then at night, maybe I'm also a chef. I can cook really well. I have this talent for cooking. I have all of these different talents and skills. Why is it that when it comes to this issue, people use this as the primary marker of who they are as a human being? What's amazing is that when you go back 150 years ago, the word homosexuality didn't even exist in the English language. I think many of us, we assume that this word was something that has always existed. It never existed before 1869 when it was first created. Now, you might be wondering, but didn't people commit this sin from a long time ago? Yes. They would commit the sin, but they would never make it the primary identifier and marker of their identity as a human being. Now, it's very clever when you look at this, because if you can make it the primary method or marker of who you are, what it means is that you can't change. You can't change. It's part and parcel of who you are. In fact, it is the most important part of who I am, even though it might be just a small sliver of who you are as a human being. When we look at Nabi Lut alayhi salam, in how he speaks to his people, he says something very interesting in the Quran, which shows that it is not an identity, rather it is simply an action. What does Nabi Lut say? In the verse of the Holy Quran, the people of Lut, they say, قَالُوا لَإِن لَمْ تَنْتَهِ يَا لُوتْ لَتَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْمُخْرَجِينَ. When the people of Lut, they became tired of all of his preaching, and he's telling them that this is a grave sin and they should stop. They became tired. They said, "Oh Lut, if you don't stop with this, we are going to exile you." Nabi Lut alayhi salam, in response, what does he say? He says, قَالَ إِنِّي لِعَمَلِكُمْ مِنَ الْقَالِينَ. He says, truly, I abhor your actions. If you go before 50 years ago, 60 years ago, people committed this sin, but they saw it as a simple action. They never saw it as the primary identity marker of who they are as human beings. And so we have to be very careful that if anyone is struggling with these kinds of inclinations, it's very important that they don't fall into the trap of thinking that it is the primary identity marker of who we are. It's simply an inclination. It's simply an action which someone can perform. This was issue number one. Issue number two, when we look at the response of Qawm Lut to their prophet, it reminds us of the response that we get sometimes today when we want to say that this culture and this action of homosexuality, it's a sin. It's amazing. Sometimes thousands of years go by and the response and the behavior of human beings remains the same. In that verse of the Holy Quran, قَالُوا لَإِن لَمْ تَنْتَهِ يَا لُوتْ لَتَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْمُخْرَجِينَ. When they see that Nabi Lut is preaching and he's saying that this is a sinful action, they don't respond in a rational way. They don't argue with Nabi Lut that it's actually a good action. What they simply say is that, "O Lut, if you continue what you are doing, then we will exile you." Now today, in the modern day world, we have a different term that is used. What do they say? They say that if you continue speaking out against this, we will cancel you. And today, cancellation, what it means is that you may lose your job for being outspoken. You may lose your social media accounts for being outspoken. In essence, you are being exiled within the society. Of course, like in the past, they would kick you out of the town entirely. Today, they say you can stay, but you won't be able to find work. Your reputation will be shot. Maybe even if there's articles about you, you won't even be able to rent a home when people, they look into your name. And so what we find is that the issue of cancellation is something that is thousands of years old. Now, what's interesting as well in another verse of the Holy Quran is that it wasn't that Qawm Lut didn't recognize the sin and the evil of what they were doing. They recognized it. When we look at one of the verses of the Quran, وَمَا كَانَ جَوَابَ قَوْمِهِ, that the answer of his people was that they said, we will exile you. And then their criticism of Nabi Lut was that they are a people who want to keep pure. And there's such a beautiful point in this verse of the Holy Quran, because they saw Nabi Lut as someone who wanted to keep pure, but they saw that as something that was disgusting. One of the things that Islam teaches us is that if someone engages in enough sin, and it always begins very small, if someone engages in enough sin, gradually those sins will increase and increase and increase until the scale in our minds of what is good and what is evil, it actually flips. Meaning that we begin to see good as evil and evil as good. And the reason for this is that Allah is a creator. He has created us in a way where we justify any action that we are doing. So even if you capture a thief, imagine that a thief comes to your house. And the thief is caught red-handed stealing something in your house. You will never find a criminal, or at least it's very rare, to find a criminal who says that what I am doing is wrong. Criminals, they justify. They say that I am stealing because X, Y, and Z. These people are rich, I'm poor. These people probably stole from others, they deserve it. We justify every single action that we perform. And so this is one of the danger points, that when we go into sin, eventually the scale flips and we begin to see good as evil and evil as good. Point number 3. When you look at the sin of Nabi Lut's wife, Qiwab, was she practicing the sin of homosexuality? The answer is no, never. Then why was she destroyed amongst her people? There's an interesting point here that Qiwab, if we were to bring it into the modern day era, if we were to bring Qiwab into the year 2024, what she would be called is an ally. She didn't engage in the sin, but what did she engage in? She supported the commission of the sin of her people. There's a hadith by Amir al-Mu'mineen. Every time I see this hadith, it shakes me. The hadith from Amir al-Mu'mineen, it says that whoever is pleased by the actions of a group of people, imagine that you see a group of people, they are committing a sin, and you are pleased within your heart with what they are doing. Amir al-Mu'mineen, he says that whoever is pleased by the actions of a group of people is like an individual that has committed that sin or has committed that action alongside them. Isn't that frightening? That if in your heart you have support, you like that some people are committing a sin, Amir al-Mu'mineen is saying that on the day of judgment, when people are resurrected, you will find that you have been resurrected with that group of people. And just imagine on the day of judgment, people are going to say, Ya Allah, but I wasn't from this group of sinners, whatever that sin may be. I wasn't from that group of sinners. Allah will answer back to them that, but you were supporting that sin in your heart. You know, sometimes we see people doing something that is Islamically not allowed. And then we see Muslims, they are supporting the sinful action of that person. One thing that I've noticed is that sometimes sisters, after 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, they decide to take off the hijab. And in that sensitive moment, many times they'll even post on social media that we've taken off the hijab. You see that people are oftentimes supporting. They are praising. We don't think to ourselves that that praise and that support, we're helping that person to get further along on that path. Now, of course, there's never any room for harshness or being rude or anything like that. But at the very least, we should not be supportive when we see someone moving away from the path of Islam. So here, the sin of qiwab was what is known today as allyship. This was number 3. Number 4, and this is a very sensitive issue. Should there be compassion or hatred towards someone who is a homosexual? And so we live in a society where it's very openly being practiced, and you see that there is a call for supporting of the lifestyle, for being tolerant of the lifestyle. And so it puts us in this position that as believers, should we have compassion or should we have a level of hatred in our hearts? Here, I want to take us to the words of Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam. Let us begin there and then we'll continue this journey. When we look at Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam, at that moment when the malaika, they come on their way to going to the people of Nabi Lut alayhi salam, they first stop at the home of Nabi Ibrahim. They stop at the home of Nabi Ibrahim, and one of the things that they tell him is that we are actually en route to destroying the people of Lut, the people of Sodom. It's amazing when we look at the Quran, the first reaction of Nabi Ibrahim. Instead of him saying that good, destroy them. Instead of saying that it's been long enough, where have you been, O Malaika? He does something else. He turns towards Allah in dua. The Quran, it mentions that Nabi Ibrahim, he says, يُجَادِلُنَا فِي قَوْمِ لُوطٍ Inna Ibrahim la halimun awahun munib. He begins to plead with Allah. He begins to ask Allah, Ya Allah, give more time to the people of Sodom. Ya Allah, forgive the people of Sodom. Ya Allah, give another opportunity to the people of Sodom. So here what we're seeing from the prophets of God is that they have a compassion for sinners. Yes, they recognize the sin, but there is a level of compassion. They don't want to see anyone destroyed. They don't want to see anyone walking on the path of sin. Ibrahim alayhi salam, he turns towards Allah, pleads for a little bit more time. Maybe the people of Sodom will change. At the same time, we have to be very careful that while there should be compassion for people on an individual level, if you have someone in the community that is struggling, they're struggling with this issue. Sometimes as a religious community, if you see someone who is struggling with this problem, we reject them, we turn against them, we're harsh against them. This is against the religion of Islam. We should be supportive of them. I remember there is a brother in the UK who he struggled with this issue. And he said that when I was struggling with this issue, I didn't know where to turn. And he actually ends up creating his own organization by the name of Strong Support. So it helps people that are in the Muslim community that are struggling with this issue. But he says, when I was growing up, I didn't know where to turn. If you go towards the sheikh in the community, he's going to look at you, with this horrible look. He's going to be afraid of you. Maybe he's even going to mention to others. If you tell others, elders in the community, maybe your reputation will be ruined. They'll behave with you in a very strange way. They don't know where to turn. And so this issue of compassion is very important. At the same time, when you look at the words of Nabi Lut alayhi salam, and all of the prophets, these are different parts of the same conversation. Nabi Lut alayhi salam, very clearly, he says to his people that I abhor your actions. I'm not going to pretend as if I am happy with what you're doing, that I support what you're doing. I'm not going to pretend as if I'm an ally of the community. No, we stand against this. We believe that this is one of the greatest of sins. And so here, when you see in a society where people are openly practicing sins, and they are calling upon you to support them in that sin, to be allies of them, it's very important that we have a line that if someone is struggling, you have compassion, you help them to the greatest degree possible. But if you see others that openly are promoting the lifestyle, they are trying to spread the lifestyle, then this is a completely different issue. This leads us to the next issue. Was the sin of Qawm Lut how they were forcing and attacking and assaulting people? Or was it the fact that they were practicing the sin? Because we were going over the story of Qawm Lut. One of the things that we mentioned is that it began by attacking travelers. That's how it began. And so one of the criticisms that people will mention against the religion of Islam, they say that Islam is not against homosexuality. What is Islam against? It is against assaulting people, attacking people. And so this is a very common point. Now, whenever you have something like this, what do? We turn towards the verses of the Quran. Because the Quran is very clear what the primary sin of Qawm Lut was. When we look at the verses of the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in one of the verses, and this verse always gets me because it's as if even Allah is surprised. Allah in this verse of the Quran, He says, أَتَعْتُونَ الذُّكْرَانَ مِنَ الْعَالَمِينَ. Allah is saying that of all of the creatures in the world, are you really approaching the males? You say this when you're surprised at something, you're shocked at something. وَتَذَرُونَ مَا خَلَقَ لَكُمْ رَبُّكُمْ مِنْ أَزْوَاجِكُمْ بَلْ أَنْتُمْ قَوْمٌ عَادُونَ. Then the following verse, it says, and you leave what your Lord has created as your mates, you are truly a people transgressing all bounds. Allah is making it very clear that the primary issue that was happening in Sodom, yes, the sin began as assault, but then it spread amongst the people and became a common practice amongst them. What Allah is punishing them for, of course, that is even a greater sin. But what He is punishing them for primarily is the sin of homosexuality. It's very clear here. Another verse of the Holy Quran, وَلُوثًا إِذْ قَالَ لِقَوْمِهِ. And Lut, when he said to his people, do you commit immorality while you can clearly see how evil it is? Lut is asking this question from his people. And then he says, أَإِنَّكُمْ لَتَعْتُونَ الرِّجَالَ شَحْوَةً مِّن دُونِ النِّسَاءِ. Do you really approach men instead of women? Truly, you are a people that are utterly ignorant. So from these verses, it's very clear that the sin of the people of Lut, alayhi salam, it wasn't the issue of what they mentioned. It was simply the sin of homosexuality. You know, sometimes you have a group of people that are, for example, thieves. Their sin is thievery. And amongst them, you're also going to have people that maybe murder in the commission of thievery. And their sin is, for example, that others, maybe they assault in the commission of thievery. But what is the main sin that they are engaged in? The main sin is the issue of stealing. And so it is the same with the people of Sodom. And so this is a very common one. If you ever see this, remember that the Quran has answered this very clearly. The sixth issue, and inshallah we will conclude it with this issue. Rather, we have two more issues actually. Inshallah, we'll push it a little bit further tonight. I had a complaint that the sessions are not long enough. I feel like the sessions are too long, but I think there's a sweet spot. The sixth issue is the very controversial question that when Nabi Lut alayhi salam, he had those people behind the gate and they're trying to get inside of the gate. The Quran mentions the story that Nabi Lut, he offers, or at least it appears, that he offers his daughters to the people that were trying to get into his house. What is the verse? The verse is, and his people came rushing towards him, and they had been long in the habit of practicing abominations. He said, "O my people, here are my daughters. They are purer for you. Now fear Allah." And then the verse continues. Question: is Nabi Lut alayhi salam throwing his daughters under the bus to protect his guests? Some people, maybe they look at this verse, they say, how horrible. This prophet of God, he's trying to protect the guests by offering these daughters of his. He's saying, marry them. The answer is that people that are into this sin, are they even interested in the daughters of Nabi Lut alayhi salam? They're not interested. So what Nabi Lut alayhi salam is essentially telling them is that you need to reform yourselves. It's a metaphor. That reform yourselves, O people. Move away from this sin. Women are purer for you than this action that you are performing. And so it's very simple as answer. The Nabi Lut, no prophet of God, no decent human being, forget about prophets of God, would ever offer his own children as a way of protecting someone that is coming from outside, his guests. The final issue is the question of whether it is possible for someone to have such an inclination and still remain a Muslim. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes there are people in our communities that are suffering from these issues. They have certain inclinations and they feel very alone. It's a very lonely place to be, especially when you have sessions when we speak about the sin of the people of Sodom. It can be very difficult. When it comes to a person that has an inclination like this, when you are struggling against this kind of inclination, not only can you remain a Muslim, in fact, the Islam of a person who has this and is fighting against this is perhaps even stronger than one who doesn't. Because they're struggling, they're fighting, they're saying that, Ya Allah, for your sake, I'm going to remain on the path that you have taught to me. And so this person is even more beloved to Allah. And this, by the way, applies to anyone that is struggling with any of the sins. That the one who is struggling with the sins, he's beloved to Allah. And we should never think that because someone maybe has this inclination, Allah hates them, Allah is punishing them. We shouldn't think any of these things. The second question. Some people, they argue that these inclinations are natural. Now, we might ask that when you say natural, what does that mean? They say, well, some people, they argue that from childhood, certain people, they had an inclination like this. And of course, others are going to argue against that. They're going to say that that is not the case. Let's assume for a moment that that is the case. There's no problem here. Let's assume that someone from a very young age, they may have this kind of inclination. Does that mean that it is okay for them to act upon it? Here, I'm going to mention something, and hopefully we can open this up. There are many inclinations, natural as well as what we would consider to be unnatural, that may exist within us, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says that even though you may have had this from a young age, or maybe it came about later, you still cannot do it. Let's give a few examples. Example number one, imagine that you have an individual who wants to get married. They have the inclination, they want to get married. But maybe they have an issue that they are dealing with. Let's say that they are, for example, disabled. And for them in that particular situation, it is extremely difficult to get married. Maybe nobody has been found who is willing to marry them. Now, this individual, there is a natural inclination, there's a natural desire. Is it okay in this situation to go towards sin? The answer is that Allah, He says no. It may be a natural inclination, but Allah, He says that you are supposed to hold yourself back. This dunya is not a dunya where we should expect that everything that we want is going to be fulfilled. There are things that we are going to want that is not going to happen. This is dunya of tests and trials. Another example. Imagine that someone has a state of poverty. He has the inclination that he wants to have a little bit of money. He wants to live a normal life, just like all of these people that are living normal lives. I want to also live a normal life. But because of societal issues, there's poverty in that society, is it allowed for him to go and steal from others in order to fulfill his needs? Again, the answer here is no. It's a natural desire to feel that you have a little bit of money to meet your basic needs, but here Allah says, I need you to be patient. Go through the doors of halal, never go through the doors of haram. So here we have another example. Example number 3. Is it not a natural inclination for a woman? And this is something that sometimes is controversial. We don't talk about it. It is natural for many women to feel that if they could not wear the hijab, then people would, for example, look at them, admire them, X, Y, and Z. There's a natural inclination amongst every human being to be seen, to be looked at. We have this, right, as human beings. It's a natural inclination, it's a natural desire. Here, because it is a natural desire, is that something where we should say, okay, the hijab should be taken off and that should be fulfilled? The answer again is no. So we have many other desires, even beyond this issue that we're discussing tonight, where there is a natural inclination, there's a natural desire. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says that, look, if you want to be successful in this dunya, you need to go down this path. These things that Islam has taught us, they are things which will take us to a path of happiness. They will avoid the harms and the damages of this dunya and the next dunya. And so Allah, He asks us to be patient and to continue to move through the Sharia. Inshallah, I hope that these were questions that maybe some of you had, and inshallah we answer some of those questions. If there's anything beyond this, we do have that portal that is online if you want to ask any of these questions. Through that, it's anonymous. Inshallah, we can tackle those on some of the coming nights. Inshallah, I wanted to just mention one of the questions that had come up that goes beyond this topic, and that was the question of whether the people of Kufa, they were Shias who ultimately killed Imam Hussein. It's a very important question because sometimes other schools of thought, they criticize the Shia. They say that you Shias, you mourn over Abu Abdullah al-Hussein while it was you, the people of Kufa, who ended up killing your Imam. So it doesn't make sense. On one hand, you killed your Imam and now you sit and you weep over him. I just wanted to answer this very briefly, inshallah, that when we look at the history of Kufa, Kufans, they were known for being amongst many different groups. We had amongst them those that supported the Shaykhain. The Shaykhain are the supporters of Abu Bakr and Umar. We had amongst them those who supported Uthman. We had amongst them who supported the Umayyads. We had amongst them who were from the Khawarij. They basically hated everyone. And we had amongst them those that were devout, ideological Shias, meaning that they had a belief in the imamate of the Ahlul Bayt. And then there were also individuals, and this was actually a sizable group, who they were not considered to be ideologically Shia, but they were considered to be politically Shia. It's a very important distinction because within these two groups, there was one that believed, yes, this is an imam that has been chosen by Allah. The other group, they said, no, we don't accept Imam Hussein, for example, or Imam Ali as a divinely appointed imam, but we recognize that this is from the family of Rasulullah. We recognize that they have more merits than other people. We have love for them, but just religiously, ideologically, we don't believe that they are supposed to be appointed by God. And so we had all of these different groups within the city of Kufa, and majority of them, when they were weighing who do we support, they began to send letters to Imam Hussein alayhi salam. So this idea that Kufa at that time was a purely Ithna Ashari Shi'i city, this is not a correct idea. You had all of these different groups, and of course you had the issue of tribalism, where it was very easy to play one tribe against another tribe. And so the Umayyads were able to use these differences between these groups, and they were able to influence them to withdraw their support for the Imam. We raise our hands in dua. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us. May He accept the tears that we shed on this night, the mourning that we engage in, and may He allow us to be from the closest followers of the Ahlul Bayt. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala